Montana Territory. Autumn of 1884, just after sundown, the barn burned like it had been soaked in lightning. The flames were already halfway up the beams when Marabeth Lorne ran barefoot through the frost-hardened grass, her shawl barely clinging to her shoulders. The blaze drowned out everything: the wind, the night birds, her own pounding heart as she reached the edge of the pasture too late. The fire had taken hold fast. Hay, tools, her father's saddle, her mother's quilt, the only photograph of her sister gone. And with them, every belonging she still had in the world. She dropped to her knees, staring at the orange glow skeleton of the barn. Her hands shook. The fire crackled and popped as the roof sagged inward with a groan. Her mare, Daisy, was still tied out back, thank God, but everything else. "What happened?" A strong voice called out from the dark. She turned, startled. A man rode up on a buckskin horse, his coat pulled tight against the cold. He dismounted fast, eyes scanning the scene. "Are you all right?" he asked. Marabeth nodded, though she was not. Her voice barely worked. "It caught fast. I was inside the house when I smelled the smoke." The man stepped forward into the firelight. He was tall, broad across the shoulders. His face was tanned from sun and wind, his jaw rough with a day's stubble. His eyes were dark and clear, serious but not harsh. "I'm Quillan Zane," he said, pulling off his hat. "I work cattle up near the Kavanaugh Ridge, saw the fire from the south trail." "Marabeth Lorne," she said, swallowing hard. "This was my father's place. He died last winter." "I've been trying to keep it going." Quillan crouched beside her, not touching, just close enough for her to feel steadier. "Do you have family nearby?" he asked. "No," she said. "None left, just me now." His eyes flicked back to the barn. "That fire didn't start by accident," he said quietly. "I smelled kerosene." Marabeth's heart dropped. "I locked the doors. There's nothing here worth stealing." "Sometimes folks just want to watch something burn," Quillan said. "You should not stay out here alone tonight." She blinked, the tears finally spilling over. "I have nothing left." "You have your life," he said. "And your horse. That's a start." The cold bit deeper, and her hands started to go numb. Without a word, Quillan shrugged out of his coat and draped it over her shoulders. It was warm from his body, heavy, and it smelled like pine and saddle soap. He gently helped her stand. "My place is just over the ridge," he said. "There's a spare room. You can stay as long as you need." She looked up at him, wary. "Why would you do that?" He met her eyes without flinching. "Because no one should have to face something like this alone." Marabeth hesitated, then nodded. It was not trust, not yet, but it was something close. Quillan saddled Daisy and helped her mount. Then he led the way, his horse's hooves crunching over the cold dirt trail. The fire behind them burned low, but the smoke still chased them down the valley. His cabin sat nestled in a grove of pines, small but solid. There was a lean-to for the horses, a neat woodpile, and smoke curling from the chimney. He opened the door and stepped back to let her in first. Inside, it smelled of coffee and firewood. A single oil lamp lit the room. The walls were lined with shelves, books, tools, and a few tin-framed photographs. Everything had a place. "You can take the bed," he said. "I'll sleep out here by the fire." "That is not necessary," she said. "I can make a pallet." "You have been through enough," he said, his voice firm but kind. "Please." She nodded, silent. He handed her a wool shirt and trousers too big but clean. He turned away while she changed behind the quilted curtain that separated the room. When she stepped out, she caught him glancing her way, and something flickered across his face. He cleared his throat and looked back to the fire. She sat across from him on the hearth, letting the heat slowly soak into her bones. Quillan poured her a cup of coffee, added a spoon of sugar. "I know it is not much," he said, handing it to her. "It is more than I had," she said quietly. They sat in silence a while. Outside, an owl called once. The fire popped. "I do not know what I am going to do," she finally said. "You do not have to figure it all tonight," he said. "Just rest." She looked over at him. "You are very calm. Most men would have ridden on." "I do not like seeing good folks suffer," he said. Then, after a pause, "And I do not think you were meant to be alone out here." She looked down at the cup in her hands. Her fingers stopped shaking. The next morning she woke to the smell of biscuits and bacon. Quillan had already fed the horses and was outside chopping wood when she stepped out into the morning light. He looked up, wiped his brow, and smiled faintly. "Breakfast is on the stove," he said. She nodded, her eyes catching on the strength in his arms, the steadiness in his movements. Later, when she offered to help with chores, he handed her a pair of gloves and said, "If you are staying, you are working." She laughed for the first time in weeks. It felt strange but good. By the end of the day they had fixed a fence, fetched water, and cleared a fallen tree near the trail. Her muscles ached, but it was the kind of ache that came from doing something useful. That night, she sat beside him again by the fire. "Marabeth," he said, voice low, "I do not know what tomorrow brings, but if there comes a day you need more than a roof, more than a hand to help, I would give you my name if it would make you feel safe." Her breath caught. "I am not offering it out of pity or obligation," he said. "I am offering because I see something in you, strength, grace, fire that does not go out." She stared at him, heart pounding. "You would marry me if you wanted it," he said. "I would." She studied his face. There was no arrogance in him, just quiet, steady truth. Her eyes stung. She nodded once. "Not tonight, but maybe someday," he smiled, slow and warm. "Then I will wait." And in the quiet that followed, something shifted between them, not rushed, not forced, but real. The fire burned low. Outside, the wind stirred the pines. And inside, Marabeth Lorne felt, for the first time in a long while, that maybe her life was not over after all. The frost didn't lift until midday. Marabeth stood in the yard, arms crossed against her borrowed shirt, watching steam rise from the horses' backs as they chewed through their feed. She'd raked the ashes from the stove, swept the porch, and chopped kindling until her hands were raw. The work steadied her, filling the hollow space left behind by what she couldn't fix. Quillan came up from the creek with his sleeves rolled and a string of trout slung over one shoulder. His forearms were marked with old scars and the pale line of a burn near his wrist. He said nothing about the fire or the night before, just looked at her with that same quiet attention, as if he were still deciding what kind of woman she might be. "You fish every morning?" she asked, brushing hair from her brow. "Only when I want supper," he said. "The smokehouse is near empty." "I can clean them," she offered. He nodded, handed her the line. "Table out back's best for it." She worked in silence, gutting and scaling with practiced hands. The fish were small but firm, caught from cold water and good for pan frying. When she finished, she brought them inside and set them on the counter. Quillan had already lit the stove and stood by the skillet, slicing potatoes into thin rounds. "You cook like a man who's had to feed himself a long while," she said. He shrugged. "Took up for my younger brothers when our folks passed. Guess I kept the habit." "How many brothers?" "3. All younger. All east of here now, Dakota Territory and parts south. One drives freight. One cuts timber. One's got a store in Deadwood. None settled," he shook his head. "We grew up moving, never figured how to stop." She leaned against the wall, arms folded. "And you?" He scraped the last of the potato into the pan. "I thought I'd stay long enough to see the cattle through the winter. But now, I might stay longer." She didn't answer. The room smelled of salt and grease, the fish crisping in the pan while the wind hummed low around the eaves. After they ate, Quillan pulled a ledger from the shelf and set it on the table between them. The pages were filled with rows of figures and careful notes in a narrow, slanted hand. "Been meaning to get this sorted," he said. "But I can't make heads or tails of what I owe the feed man." She scanned the column, tapping one number with her finger. "This line's wrong. You carried the 7 down twice." His brows lifted. "You good with numbers, my father taught me. He did trade with the railroad before he took ill." "I kept his accounts once he couldn't." Quillan sat back. "I could use help if you're willing." "I'd rather earn my keep than be beholden," she said. He reached for a pencil. "Then let's get to it." They worked until the sun dipped low again, casting long shadows across the floor. Quillan built the fire higher and poured them each a mug of chicory. Outside, the cold settled heavy, muffling the world. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked suddenly. "The moving," he took a long sip before answering. "Sometimes. But I'm tired of leaving things behind." She traced the rim of her mug. "I lost more than just the barn." "I know." She looked up. "You don't ask questions. I figure you'll tell me what matters when it does." They sat there a while, not speaking, the hush between them more full than empty. Later, as he spread his bedroll near the fireplace, he said, "I'll be heading into town tomorrow. Supply run. You could come if you wanted." "I don't have money." "You wouldn't need any." She hesitated. "I'll come. But only if you let me carry the ledger. I've got questions for the feed man." He lay back on the rug, folding his arms behind his head. "Then it's settled." She watched the firelight flicker against the walls, a quiet warmth growing beneath her ribs. He hadn't touched her hand, hadn't tried to soften her with charm or promises. Just steady offers and space to choose. For the first time in weeks, she slept without waking. The next morning, the sun rose behind a veil of high cloud, casting the landscape in a soft, silvery light. Marabeth adjusted the collar of her borrowed coat and stepped up into Quillan's wagon, settling beside a sack of oats and a crate of dried apples. The cold pinched her cheeks, but the air was clean, the kind that filled a person up from the inside. Quillan flicked the reins and the team started down the slope, wheels creaking over frozen ruts. The road to town ran between low hills and stands of bare cottonwoods, the branches etched like bone against the sky. They passed a pair of antelope grazing far off, their breath rising in small clouds. "Do you come into town often?" she asked, watching the terrain roll past. "Only when something runs out," he said. "Or when I need to send word east." She glanced at him. "You write your brothers, once in a while." "When I think they ought to know I'm still upright." She pulled her gloves tighter. "I used to write my sister every month. She never wrote back, but I kept sending letters." She passed before the rest. Marabeth didn't answer right away. "She ran off with a man headed for the Nevada mines. Promised to send for us. Never did. My mother waited 2 years before she stopped setting a place for her at supper." Quillan didn't speak, but his hands eased on the reins, letting the team slow as they reached a narrow bend where the river ran close. They reached town before noon. It was little more than a scatter of low buildings and corrals, with a smithy, a general store, and a clapboard saloon that leaned slightly to one side. Smoke curled from the chimneys, and a dog barked from behind the livery as they pulled in. Marabeth climbed down and brushed dust from her hem. A boy around 12 came out to meet them, his face red from the cold. "Mr. Zane," the boy said, taking the lead rope. "You want them watered." "Both, and check their shoes," Quillan said. "They've had a long haul." Inside the store, the warmth hit like a wall. Shelves were stacked with bolts of calico, tins of lard, nails, and sacks of flour. A pot-bellied stove glowed near the back, and a woman behind the counter gave them a nod without asking their names. Quillan stepped aside, letting Marabeth speak first. "I'm looking for the man who sold feed to the Lorne homestead," she said to the woman. 2 months ago or more." "That'd be my husband," the woman replied. "He's out at the freight yard, but I keep the books." Marabeth pulled the folded ledger from her coat and opened it flat. "This line here," she said, tapping the page. "You charged for 3 sacks of oats. We only received 2. The woman squinted at the numbers. "You're right. That's my mistake. I'll mark it down now." Quillan gave a quiet nod from behind her, watching as she made the correction. Outside, snow had begun to fall in slow, lazy flakes. Marabeth tilted her face toward it. "I didn't expect that to go so smoothly," she said. "Truth's hard to argue with," Quillan said. "Most folks just don't bring it with them." They stopped next at the blacksmith's, where Quillan bartered for new hinges and a length of chain. Marabeth wandered across the street to the dry goods window, where a bolt of deep green wool caught her eye. She didn't touch it, just looked until the wind forced her back. On the way out of town, they passed the churchyard. The fence was new, cedar rails pale against the snow. Marabeth watched a man kneeling by one of the stones, his hat pressed to his chest. She turned her gaze away. "I buried my father without a preacher," she said. "The roads were too deep with snow." Quillan didn't fill the silence. He just kept the team steady, letting the quiet settle around them like another blanket. By the time they reached the cabin again, the snow had stopped. The roof held a thin layer of white, softening the edges of the shingles. Marabeth carried the smaller parcels inside, setting them beside the hearth. As she unwrapped a tin of coffee, she asked, "Was it always your plan to live this far out?" He set down the chain and crouched to stoke the fire. "I thought I'd try it one season. Then spring came and I stayed. Some land asks you to keep it." She sat by the window, watching the last light turn the snow to gold. "I used to think I'd marry a man who built furniture, someone who worked with fine things. My father made me believe I was meant for quiet days." Quillan leaned against the wall, arms folded. "You still could." "I don't think quiet suits me anymore," she said, voice low. He stepped forward slowly, stopping just before her. "You think hard work and long winters mean you've lost something. I think they've carved you into someone who sees straight." She looked up at him. "I don't know if I can offer much." "I'm not asking for much," he said. "Just what's real." The fire snapped behind them. Marabeth reached out, her fingers brushing his. Not a promise, just a beginning. He didn't move away. Outside, the snow thickened again, covering the path that led to what came next. By midweek, the wind shifted. It came down from the north with a sharper edge, biting at the gaps in the cabin walls. Marabeth patched what she could with canvas strips and wool, her fingers stiff by the time she finished. The work gave her rhythm, but not direction. Her mind kept circling the same unlit corners, the scorched shape of the barn, the empty place where her mother's quilt had hung, the weight of Quillan's coat still folded on the chair. He returned late that afternoon from checking the cattle, his boots rimmed with ice. She met him at the door with a basin of warm water and her last clean rag. "You've got a split in your knuckle," she said, nodding to his hand. He sat on the stool by the hearth and held it out. "Fence wire. Caught me when the wind kicked up." She dipped the rag and began cleaning the blood, her touch careful. "You ought to wrap it." "I will," he said. "Once the sting fades." She tied the cloth around his hand, then stood, wiping hers on her skirt. He watched her a moment longer than he needed to, his jaw shifting like he was weighing whether to speak. "I've been thinking about that fire," he said finally. "You said the doors were locked." "They were," she said. "I checked them before I went inside. No prints in the ash. No sign of someone coming in from the road." She folded her arms. "Then it had to be someone who knew the land." He nodded once. "There's a man up near the old rail spur, Vernon Tolley. He's been run off 3 claims in the last 5 years. Lot of folks think he's set more than one blaze to make room." "I've heard that name," she said. "He came through last summer, asking about water rights. You tell him no." I told him the well was dry past September. He didn't like hearing it. Quillan leaned back, boots stretched toward the fire. You'd know his face. I would. He stood and crossed to the shelf, pulling down a small tin box. Inside was a worn Colt revolver, oiled and loaded. He held it out, grip first. I don't keep a gun, she said. Then start, he said. If he comes back, you'll want more than a locked door. She took it slow. The metal felt heavier than it should have. I'll show you how to use it, he added. She nodded, jaw set. They spent the next morning in the back field where the snow had thinned under the pines. Quillan set up a line of tin cans on a log. She missed the first 4 shots, her hands too tight on the grip. Let it settle in your palm, he said. Don't fight it. She exhaled, steadied, and clipped the edge of the 5th can. It tumbled into the snow. He lowered his arms. There you go. She looked down at the revolver. It feels like it belongs to someone else. It won't always. They walked the rest of the fence line in silence, the snow crunching underfoot. A magpie flitted from tree to tree ahead of them, keeping pace. At the far edge of the field, where the land sloped toward the creek, she stopped. I never told you about the night my father died, she said. He'd been sick a long time. I sat beside him for 3 days, barely slept. On the 4th morning, he asked me to read to him, just the Bible. No sermon, just the words. Quillan waited. He passed before I finished the chapter. I buried him before sundown. No neighbors came, too far, too cold. He didn't offer sympathy. Just stood beside her, shoulders squared against the wind. When the ground thaws, he said, we'll build him a proper marker. You tell me what it should say. She looked up at him. Why do you keep offering me things? He didn't hesitate. Because I want you here, not just passing through. Not just surviving. She searched his face, the steadiness there. I'm not sure I know how to be with someone, she said. Not anymore. I'm not asking you to be anything but as you are, he said. I'm not in a hurry, but I won't walk away. The wind rustled the dry grass below the snow line. She reached for his hand, the one wrapped in cloth. He let her take it, calloused palm warm against hers. They stood that way until the sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the field. No promises were spoken, but something in the quiet between them turned solid. When they returned to the cabin, she placed the revolver on the mantel, not hidden, not displayed. Just there. Later, as she stirred supper, she glanced over her shoulder and said, If spring comes and I'm still here, you'll teach me to ride with a rifle. Quillan set down the kindling he'd been splitting. I'll teach you whatever you want to learn. She smiled without looking away from the pot. Not because of the words, but because of the man who meant them. Outside, the sky held the color of pewter, and the land lay still beneath it. Inside the cabin, the fire burned steady, and both of them, in their own quiet way, had chosen to stay. By late March, the snow had melted down to patches in the hollows, and the earth beneath their boots turned soft and dark. The sky had taken on a higher, clearer blue, and the creek ran fuller, carving deeper into its banks with the sound of steadier things. Marabeth pulled the last of the winter onions from the root cellar, brushing the dirt from their skins. Quillan was outside, driving fence posts along the southern boundary, his shirt sleeves rolled and a flush of sun on his neck. She watched him through the open door for a moment, feeling a quiet she hadn't known since, before her mother fell ill, something that lived not in stillness, but in the shape of something lasting. That evening, she brought out the quilt she'd started the winter before the fire. Most of it had survived, tucked away in her travel trunk. She spread it across the kitchen table and began stitching where she'd left off, her hands steadier now, her stitches even. You do that by memory? Quillan asked, setting a pail of well water near the stove. I had the pattern once, she said, but I know it by feel now. He dried his hands and leaned against the wall, watching her work. You could sell those, Come summer, there'll be folks passing through again." She didn't look up. "I'm not sure I want to make things for strangers. I think I'd rather fill this place instead, with quilts, with things that mean something." He crossed the room and sat beside her, quiet a moment. "Then, I got a letter from my brother Cal. He wants to know if I aim to come east for the fall roundup." "Are you going?" she asked. I told him I'd found something better worth building. She set her needle down, her breath catching before she could help it. "I mean to ask you something," he said, voice low. She turned to him, the lamplight laying soft across his jaw. "I know the ground's not settled yet and the roof leaks when it storms, but there's room here, for more, for you, for what we might grow." Her throat tightened. "You're asking me to stay permanent." "I am." She looked at the half-finished quilt, the careful way it had come together piece by piece, stitch by stitch, and then back at him. "I've already started putting roots down. I didn't mean to, but they're there." He reached for her hand, rough palm closing gently over hers. "I don't want to build a life beside you," she said. "I want to build it with you." He didn't answer with words, just leaned forward, pressing his forehead to hers, their hands still joined between them. The warmth that passed between them wasn't sudden. It was the kind that had grown quiet and strong over days of shared labor, quiet meals, and trust that didn't need naming. They were married in late April by the circuit preacher who traded sermons for a place at supper. The ceremony was held beneath the cottonwoods near the creek, new green unfurling along the branches overhead. Marabeth wore a dress she'd sewn from the bolt of green wool she'd once paused to admire, and Quillan wore his good coat, brushed and mended at the elbow. Neighbors came from farther than she expected, some who'd once traded with her father, others who'd heard of the fire and wanted to offer something more than silence. She looked out at the small crowd and felt, for the first time, the shape of community gathering around her. After the vows, Quillan didn't speak much. He pulled her into a slow dance beneath the trees while the wind moved through the grass, and his hand settled warm against her back, steady as ever. By summer, the cabin had a new roof, and Marabeth had planted a kitchen garden behind the shed. They cleared the ash from the barn site and laid a new foundation with stone from the creek. She stitched curtains for the front windows, and Quillan built a bench for the porch from oak he'd split and planed himself. One morning, as she hung laundry on the line, she paused, hand on her belly. The feeling had come quietly, without fanfare, but it was sure. She waited until the sun had crossed the southern hill before telling him. He didn't speak right away, just stepped forward and took her face in both hands. "You've given me more than I knew how to want," he said. They built a cradle that same week. When autumn came, the trees turned gold and the first frost painted the morning grass silver. People passing by the trail near the ridge could see smoke curling from the chimney, the scent of cornbread drifting on the air. And if they looked close, they might catch the shape of two figures on the porch, one reading aloud from a book, the other whittling something small with steady hands. Inside that house, all things had a place. The revolver stayed over the mantel, untouched. The ledger rested beside the Bible. The quilt lay folded at the end of the bed they shared, finished now. It seems tight and true. And in the quiet that held through the changing seasons, Quillan and Marabeth Zane lived as they had begun, side by side, not bound by words but by the life they built with their hands and their hearts. Nothing lost, nothing left behind, only what was earned and kept.